I'm supposed to talk to you about education for freedom, as opposed to education for slavery. It's pretty simple, but it starts with a really simple premise, and I'm just going to give it to you. It's so simple everyone ignores it, but it's a premise with a lot of potential. And it goes like this. The world is the way it is because education is the way it is. And education is the way it is because the world is the way it is. What could be more simple? But what are we going to do about it? It's kind of like a knot that has to be broken. It's going to be probably broken around education. How do you do that? How are we really educated? What I'm going to talk about basically is the whole principle of what, first of all, would the world be like if we really were educated for freedom. But that means we have to know how that education works with respect to slavery as well. And slavery and freedom have to be defined first. And I'm going to do that. But then I'm going to go beyond that and try and sort of show, and there's a grid here that I've actually constructed, and we'll show that later. I don't want you to be, oh, it's behind me now. Oh, well, my thunder, it's okay. You can leave it up there. Don't worry about it. I'll get into it in a minute. But we have to first define that before you can understand how you can make the shift. Because I'm talking about a huge shift. And it's too bad at these TED Talks we can't refer to other speakers because I have a lot to say to those who've already gone before me and perhaps to those who've gone after me. But I'm going to follow the rules. First of all, freedom and slavery. There's nothing very mysterious about it. Freedom is simply the possibility of growth and change. And slavery is everything that prevents that. That's all. Just thought I'd give you some complex philosophical torture right now. No, it's only that. That's a lot. And think about that for a minute. Something that allows you to really flourish and grow. And imagine right now, the school you went to. Did it give you that? And if not, why didn't it give you that? But more specifically, remember what I started off with. There's a nexus here between education and world. In order to understand that nexus between education and world, you have to understand the world according to how it would be if your education was not really free. Now to do that though, I have to do one more thing. And this might be a little difficult, but we have to remember that education is a way of relating to the world. And when I say world, I don't just mean a big hunk or a big block. I mean a set of relationships that we all have. Because the world isn't just nothing, it's not a blob, it's the way we relate. But if you relate via education, that means that relationship has to be connected with knowledge. Knowledge, but knowledge is not a simple thing to understand. How do you do that? What is our knowledge relationship? And here, I'm going to present to you two axes of understanding. And we've already been talking about them since these TED Talks began, but I'm just going to give it a kind of verbal structure to it. And I want you to try and keep this into your head. Part of this is behind me, but somehow I don't dare turn around and look at it. Because if I did, I'll lose this wonderful connection I have with you right now. And I hate doing that. But let's start off with one thing that everyone knows about. It's the way that most people are educated at schools, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like Seinfeld, there's nothing wrong with that. And that's called mastery. Mastery means, well, sort of like another speaker said, who I cannot mention, but would be associated with critical thinking. It means that you look at something objectively, you look at something in order to be able to somehow control it. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That's really important. But it immediately suggests another pole, and that other pole is surrender. I mean, what's the opposite of mastery? It's surrender. Is that taught in schools? Not really. Surrender has to do, and it's most appropriately done if you surrender to the infinite. Is that taught in schools? No. In fact, if I tried to present that to a dean or one of my colleagues, they wouldn't understand what I was saying, and then they'd have me committed. Surrender to the infinite. It's associated with religion, but authentic religion. So you might think, oh, so are you saying, Ron, that people are only half educated because they're only educated towards mastery? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying they're only a quarter educated because there's two other axes. Worse than you think. What you see behind you is, of course, an example of transcending. It's sometimes known as speculation, and you have to be educated towards that as well. What does it mean to speculate? It means to step back, like I can see all of you. Wow, a whole group of people are actually paying attention to me, unlike my own students, because believe it or not, I might have won all these awards, but there's a lot of students who hate my guts. But that's okay. That's part of what it means to challenge people. So stepping back means like climbing a mountain, gaining a wide perspective on things. And that's considered evil in a lot of academic circles because it isn't mastery. No, it's not. It's getting the big picture, what TED is all about. And notice it had to happen at TED, not at the university where you have to fight tooth and nail to have any kind of speculation going on. But there's an opposite to that, which we have been talking about by another speaker whom I cannot name, but who might have been just in front of me. And that's associated with intimacy. The opposite of transcending is being close. Intimacy. Intimacy means you're one with something, and you learn about it that way, because all these are forms of learning. You learn by mastery, you learn by surrender. That's how spiritual individuals learn. You learn by stepping back, and you learn by being close. Those are the two axes. And if you only know one of these, you are only 1/4 educated, which isn't good. Now, what does that have to do with the world? Because all these things I'm talking about, mastery, surrender, transcending, intimacy, that's only what you would call a neutral term of education and relating to the world. What I'm going to do now is talk about how those things can be done unfreely as opposed to freely. And once I've done that, the whole shooting match is going to be done. Because it's only if you look at the big picture that you're ever going to reform education. And if you reform education, guess what? You will reform the world. Imagine people being taught to do these things well by experts in all of these areas, instead of just having the masters teach mastery. Not that there's anything wrong with that. So let's start with a big one, mastery. Mastery can be done badly. It can be done through routinization, and that's an unfree thing. Can you do it in a positive way? Yeah. You can do it through learning to master the self. And imagine what that would mean if students were actually taught to master the self instead of master the physical world. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I know you've heard that before. But it's really important that they understand that, because that kind of routinization unfortunately takes place in education and makes it really stink. Everyone hates the fact of a classroom being a place of routine, where in a sense you're also not just learning things in a routine way, you're learning methods, but nothing else. And that goes out into the world. A world of self-mastery means that you won't be tempted to try and dominate the world so much because you've mastered yourself. And how much world domination is based on the idea that you haven't mastered yourself? Let's zoom down the line here. What about the other one, the one associated with surrender? That exists a lot in our world too, and it's called escapism. Instead of surrendering to the infinite, and how many people would know the infinite if it even bit them? The point is, the infinite is a real thing. And if you're taught to surrender to that, you've learned an enormous amount, but you're not. In effect, what people do is escape by surrendering to something finite. That's called ideology, fanaticism, evil, and stupidity. And that has to be brought to mind. That means I'm going to have a whole bunch of religious people hating my guts, but they're not being properly educated to take their religion and realize that you have to surrender to the infinite. And someone say, I'm not comfortable doing that. Too bad. This is what it means. Let's go forward. What would a world be like where education involved that? Well, it would be one in which you'd be inspired all the time. Instead of having this idea of surrendering to something finite, you'd be open to always to the infinite. But let me see what that means. How does that work in schools? Now, this is really crucial, and it happens all the time. It goes like this. In schools, you are taught, without even thinking, that the status quo outside is basically okay. And now you could say, here goes back to the theme of critical thinking. No, the status quo is evil. No, it's neither of those things. The status quo is neither evil, nor is it good. It's provisional. Imagine that became an educational strategy, and you approached the world without saying evil, good, but it's provisional, because that means you would always change, always transform. It's a subtle thing in a way. But imagine, always, people go through classes in schools and they just sort of jump out there while, radical professors get students to go really wild and say, let's tear down the world. Or the other way, the world's okay, we just have to adjust to it. No, it's just provisional. It's always been provisional. But think of it that way. Let's go to the other one, transcending. Normally, that doesn't take place very much. Transcending means, of course, to take the big picture view. What happens, of course, in schools and the corrupt education is disciplinarity. Now, I know everyone at the U of C where I teach says interdisciplinarity is great, but they don't really believe it, nor do they even understand it. Now, the reason for that is they just believe you bring disciplines together to solve a given problem. No. Instead, what I mean by disciplinarity, interdisciplinarily, I actually call it integral disciplinarity, means to step back and show how all knowledge is related to all other knowledge. And if you think that's impossible, well, that's because you haven't tried it. And most people don't even want to bother to try. And that's the sad thing about it. Integral disciplinarity, as opposed to interdisciplinarity, means there is a place in the university where you talk about everything. And you have psychologists, philosophers, scientists. You've all heard of the idea that two cultures of C.P. Snow, that scientists and humanists can't talk to each other. Hey, it can make this worse. People of the spirit don't talk to each other. They don't have a place there. But if you had all of those things together, my God, what an amazing thing that would be. And you'd have a world that was characterized by imagination, not by let's stick to our disciplines. The fourth thing, remember, intimacy is a form of knowing that you get close to each other. What we have instead is what I call rigidification. That's also what makes school such a miserable experience. How many people would say, hooray, I'm going to school. I have a daughter who hates it. Shouldn't have said that, but everyone's going to go to her school. But you know what? That's true. And so many others are the same way. They're looking forward to when the school comes to an end. That shouldn't be that way. But it's based on the fact that things have to be rigidified. Rigidification means that, you've basically, I guess you'd say the word is, subjected everyone to classification. That's a pun, guys, and I'll explain the pun because you're not laughing. It means putting people into classes. Not 1,000 classes. Grades are a form of classification. It's a form of speciation. And you know Darwin, you've all heard of him, of course. He believed that species are only provisional things anyway. Your species are only things that exist at the moment, at a given time. Imagine that you didn't have that. Once things get rigid, and the rigidity is in the relationship between teacher and student, student and student, it's because people do not know how to talk. In fact, instead of talking, instead of really communicating, there is just these parts of a rigid structure that you have to adapt to. Classes, grading. I call it degrading, because it is degrading. It should be upgrading. I should have been an advertiser, right? I know a lot of this sounds like cliches, but I'm getting at something kind of important here. I'm not going to talk so much about the tribal class because there's no time, but the essence of the tribal class, when you get down to it, is nothing more than establishing a network of communication whereby people talk about everything, everything is provisional, everything is up for grabs, and that conversation is real, and that's life, and that's what makes it, hey, I look forward to going to school. How far back can that go? I don't know. Could it take place in grade 2, grade 1? I don't know. I've only worked at it in universities. But let's see. I've got to bring this to a conclusion now. What I've talked about here is education for freedom as opposed to slavery. But the education for slavery, which is everything on the unfreedom side, is something that we don't even know exists. We often think we're educated for freedom when we're not. It's actually a slavery that thinks it's freedom. What I'm talking about is a true education for freedom, one in which you cover all these four poles, you look at the negative and the positive, you have the big picture, and one of the things that enslaves us more than anything else is the narrowness of the picture. It can't be so narrow if you're ever to hope to change anything. And I've seen so much here that gives me hope of that kind of change occurring. And what would it look like? Really simple. It would be a world, of exploration. I didn't even mention that, but instead of mastery, you explore the world. It'd be a world of inspiration where you're open to maybe levels of consciousness that you didn't know existed. That's what it means to be inspired. It'd be a world of imagination where you're always pulling things together and looking at the big picture. And lastly, it would be a world of communication where you're not caught up in the rigidities of grades and classes and things like that. Not that there's even anything wrong with those, as long as they're taken to be provisional. And that's what leads possibly to a world that might really, really, really be worth living in, and a school one would look forward to going instead of waiting for summer holidays. Thank you very much.